Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Economics with Mr. Cole. And today I will be continuing the second part of this set of slides surrounding the key question, what happens to Singapore when world interest rates rise? So this is the part two of this two-part video. In the previous video, I went over part A, explained why a small and open economy like Singapore would have its monetary policy centered on exchange rates rather than interest rates. So in this video, we will be going over part B, discuss the likely effects of a rise in world interest rates on Singapore's internal stability. That's 15-mark question, higher order, and requires evaluation or synthesis. And before I go over the content proper, I would like to remind my students on some of the band descriptors that I would expect to see in a response at the top band of marks. Remember, this is impression marking via the levels of response mark scheme and not point marking. So under knowledge and understanding, application and analysis, I would expect candidates to have perceptive understanding of the specific requirements of the question throughout the answer. Broadly speaking, breadth and depth requirements exceed expectations. There is evidence of detailed knowledge of relevant facts and theory. Relevant economic theories fully explained and or applied to opposite situations. The terms are used appropriately throughout the response. And there is evidence of the candidate's ability to describe and explain in an accurate, precise, logical, and reasoned manner, where appropriate relevant diagrams are included and fully explained. And relevant real-world examples are identified and fully developed to support the argument or add depth and fullness to the answer. Now, in terms of evaluation, right? So if you are doing the Singapore's version of the A-levels, that would be 5 marks. The response contains evidence of effective and balanced synthesis or evaluation. So it critically evaluates economic information, arguments, proposals, and policies, taking into consideration relevant information and economic principles and distinguishing facts from hypothetical statements and value judgments. And an answer may build on appropriate analysis to evaluate contemporary issues, perspectives, or policy choices. It may recognize unstated assumptions of the question or the model and evaluates their relevance. Or it may synthesize economic arguments to arrive at well-reasoned judgments and decisions. Right? So the evaluation component is actually not present in part A of this question. So you're not expected to evaluate for part A, but for part B, it's a requirement. All right. So in terms of the content, I thought it would be quite intuitive, so to speak, to adopt a chronological approach. I thought that would make the most sense. So I thought about it. It could be answered in different ways, but let's go with this approach. So first and foremost, world interest rates rise. So in the very short run, this means that Singapore's interest rates will be temporarily, only for a very short period of time, lower than global interest rates. This means that there are hot money outflows out of Singapore because short-term investors would seek higher rates of return elsewhere in the world. And as a result, there's depreciation of the Singapore dollar, leading to a rise in net exports, of course, assuming that the Marshall-Lerner condition holds. Now, this continues for a while, and Singapore's money supply would naturally decrease, leading to a rise in domestic interest rates. And so very quickly, Singapore's interest rates would equalize with the global rate. And this is really important because in Part A, we established that Singapore is an interest rate taker. So it has no control over its interest rates. So in other words, there is no monetary autonomy. And if you're still not sure, you should revisit my previous video on Part A, where I went over the impossible trinity, or the open economy trilemma. Right. So as a result, after a while, Singapore's own consumption expenditure and investment expenditure would fall, leading to a fall in AD. And major countries would see a fall in their CNI. Thus, their national income would also fall. And they start importing less goods from overseas, including from Singapore. And Singapore exports a lot of products to overseas markets. So that means that Singapore's export revenue would fall, and leads to a fall in AD. Foreign direct investment into Singapore also falls, worsening the balance of payments, and thus also lowering AD, and that is because FDI is a component of I. Now, this actually is the most significant point given the nature of Singapore's economy, which is very small, open, trade dependent, and its economic growth is driven a lot by exports. Right, so the continued FDI outflows and lower domestic I will have a long-run impact. So Singapore's long-run aggregate supply would rise more slowly. And of course, remember to answer the question and relate your explanation to the impact on Singapore's internal stability, including economic growth that splits into actual and potential dimensions of growth, unemployment, as well as inflation. Candidates can use other structures other than a chronological approach, but should attempt to present a balanced answer. That means including positive and negative facts on Singapore's domestic economy. So first point, on a very short run, development of the first body paragraph. When world interest rates rise, Singapore's domestic interest rates are temporarily lower. leading to hot money outflows as short-term investors seek higher returns in other countries. So the demand for the Singapore dollar falls, leading to a depreciation. And if the Marshall-Lerner condition holds, that is the sum of the magnitudes of the price elasticities of demand for export and import is greater than 1, then net exports would rise, leading to a rise in AD and causing actual economic growth and a fall in cyclical unemployment. So diagrammatically, remember this is a tool of economic analysis using graphical analysis. First of all, assume that Singapore is operating at the intermediate range of the AS curve. So when AD rises from AD0 to AD1, okay, the economy approaches closer to full employment national income, YF. Therefore, supply bottlenecks worsen, and producers first respond to higher demand partly by increasing real output and partly by raising prices. The rise in production means that more resources are employed, including labor, therefore lowering cyclical unemployment. Now, what I'm doing here is depth development. So I'm trying to explain the impact on Singapore's internal stability with greater depth using more detailed, so to speak, economic elaboration. With higher real incomes, such as wages, there will be higher actual economic growth indicated by a rise in real GDP, right? So from Y0 to Y1. And finally, with fewer resources though, prices are bid up. Thus, there is some demand pull inflation as well. And the general price level rises from P0 to P1. Right. But remember, the depreciation of the Singapore dollar will also lead to prices of imported goods and raw materials being higher in domestic currency, the Singapore dollar. So that means there's a rise in the cost of production represented by an upward shift of the SRAS curve from SRAS 0 to SRAS 1. Producers then pass on the higher costs to consumers in the form of higher prices. So the cost of living rises. The purchasing power of household falls and expenditure falls, right? So there is an upward movement along the AD curve, along AD1, right? And cost push inflation occurs, so GPL rises. Sorry, there is a typo here. It should be from P1 to P2 for cost push inflation. All right. And firms cut down on production and real output falls. There is negative actual growth represented by the real GDP falling from Y1 and back to Y0. Next, in terms of the short run, so that was the very short run, and now I'm going to go over the short run. With continued hot money outflows, Singapore's money supply decreases, leading to a rise in interest rates. And remember, Singapore is an interest rate taker, so this means that it will keep rising until it equalizes with the global rate, first leading to a fall in consumption and investment. So For this one, I'm going to use the marginal efficiency of investment analysis. Thus, a higher interest rate would lead to a lower quantity of domestic investment, I falls, and AD falls. LRAS will also rise more slowly than before due to the fall in I. Right. And with higher interest rates, consumers in Singapore are also less willing and able to make purchases of big ticket items that require interest payments. Therefore, consumption expenditure falls, leading to a fall in AD. Again, what's expected is ADAS analysis, although if it was already done earlier in terms of the depth development, there's no need to repeat major points. And in the medium and long run, because major countries see a fall in their consumption and investment due to their high interest rates to begin with, their national income starts to fall as well. And they begin importing fewer goods from overseas, including from Singapore, and therefore Singapore's exports will fall, alongside a decrease in foreign direct investment as well. All right, so AD falls, right? So as FDI is part of I, which in turn is a part of AD will fall as well. So they reinforce each other, X falls and I falls. Right, so in the long run, this would lower the rate of growth of LRAS. And note that this will not lower LRAS. It's quite hard for LRAS to fall. Because that means that, for example, the quantity of capital falls, but that only occurs, for example, in a natural disaster when machinery capital is destroyed. All right, but in this case, it just means that capital accumulation is slower. Right. And of course, ADAS analysis. And remember, this is the most significant point because Singapore is highly trade dependent. All right. So a few tips with regard to evaluation of synthesis, because remember, this is a higher order thinking question. So make sure that there are well-defined criteria and judgments are made on these criteria. Where possible, contest unstated assumptions, but do not provide a summary of earlier points. It's not a summary, it's an evaluation of what you have wrote in your body paragraphs earlier. So this is a sample response, right? In conclusion, the likely effects of the rise in world interest rates on Singapore's internal stability depends on the current state of the Singapore economy. So in reality, last year, 2022, Singapore's inflation rate was rather high at 6.1%. But if this was attributed mainly to cost push factors like rise in energy prices, then the increase in global interest rates will lead to a further fall in SRAS, right, via the depreciation route that we analyzed earlier. Therefore, this would worsen cost push inflation. It also depends on other factors that might affect foreign economies, right? So they might very well see a rise in interest rates, but other factors would also affect the marginal efficiency of investment, such as business optimism. So if the latter offsets the former, the foreign economy's investment expenditure might still rise, and thus they might still see a rise in national income and import from overseas, including from Singapore. So Singapore would benefit from a rise in export revenue and thus AD. And also, it depends on policy measures that the Singapore government or the central bank may adopt. So the central bank MAS may further strengthen the Singapore dollar to mitigate cost push inflation, right? Although this would lead to a fall in net exports and thus AD, even though it tries to curb cost push inflation by raising SRAS, right? This sample is by no means exhaustive. I would encourage you to come up with your criteria, make sure they're well defined, and make sure that you try to challenge some assumptions where possible and make it habitual, right, in formulating evaluative points. All right, so come to the end of this part B of the essay question of the second part of the two-part video. And again, just a very quick reminder that I do offer tutoring via Zoom and in person for the following syllabuses and subject codes. And my profile. And if you wish, you could contact me at damasco@gmail.com. All right. That's it. Goodbye.